He put his money in the most boring thing imaginable. He ignored the hype. He embraced the boring. He learned that time, not timing, was the real secret to wealth. While others panicked, his patience paid off. Watch now the boring path to $1 million. The great storm did not end with a single, bright day of recovery. It receded like a tide, leaving behind a transformed landscape. The V-shaped recovery on the chart was a clean, mathematical story, but the human experience was messier, more nuanced. For Evan, the months that followed were a period of profound, quiet metamorphosis. The panic had passed, but in its wake, it had forged something new in him, a core of tempered steel. This scene is not about the money compounding, but about the self-compounding. He found he could no longer engage with the daily financial news. The hysterical headlines, the breathless predictions of gurus, the constant drumbeat of crisis, it all felt like meaningless noise. He had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had shown him what truly mattered: his plan, his discipline, his time horizon. He canceled his subscriptions to market news feeds. He deleted the financial news apps from his phone. It wasn't an act of ignorance, but one of profound focus. He was pruning the distractions, allowing the signal of his long-term strategy to emerge from the static. This act of digital minimalism felt as liberating as purging his physical possessions. He was protecting his most valuable asset, his attention. His interactions on the long path for him changed. He was no longer just a learner, a seeker of reassurance. He found himself naturally falling into the role Riverstone and others had played for him. When a new member, trembling hand, posted in a panic about a 5% dip, Evan didn't just offer a platitude. He shared a screenshot of his own portfolio's terrifying plunge during the storm. The sheer scale of the loss stark and undeniable. Then, next to it, he posted the recovery chart. His message was simple: I felt this. I survived it. You will too. Your plan is your anchor. Trust it. He was no longer just cathedral builder. He was becoming a foundation for others. This shift from student to mentor solidified his own learning in a way that mere reading never could. Articulating the principles of Stoic investing to someone else forced him to live them more fully. He found a new sense of purpose in this quiet, digital mentorship. It was a form of giving back, of contributing to the same community that had saved him. The compounding of his knowledge was now yielding dividends of wisdom and service. His relationship with his day job underwent a final, decisive shift. The storm had proven that his real security did not come from his employer, but from his own accumulated capital and unshakable mindset. He began to view his work not as a career, but as a funding source for his life's design. This wasn't a cynical perspective. It was a liberating one. The petty office politics, the stress of difficult customers, the pressure to perform for a promotion he didn't want, it all lost its power over him. He was pleasant, professional, and competent, but he was emotionally divested. He was playing a game to earn the chips he needed to stop playing, and knowing the exit strategy made the game itself almost enjoyable. He had achieved a degree of financial independence in his mind long before he would achieve it in his bank account. He started a new ritual. On the first of every month, after his automatic transfer had been executed, he would not check his portfolio balance. Instead, he would open his life design blueprint document. He would spend an hour refining it, adding details, questioning his assumptions. What did a truly fulfilling week look like? What skills did he want to learn when time was no longer a commodity to be sold? He wrote about wanting to learn woodworking, to volunteer with a literacy program, to spend a month hiking a long trail. The portfolio was the engine, but this document was the map to the destination. The act of planning his future freedom became a source of present-day joy. It made the modest sacrifices feel not like deprivations, but like strategic investments in a future he was actively designing, brick by mental brick. This period also brought a deeper, more philosophical understanding of risk. He realized that the greatest risk was not a market crash. The market had crashed, and he was fine. The greatest risk was not participating. It was the risk of letting his savings be eroded by the silent, insidious theft of inflation. It was the risk of being entirely dependent on a paycheck deep in old age. It was the risk of a life lived by default, not by design. Volatility was just the price of admission for the incredible growth that lay on the other side. By surviving the storm, he had paid that price in full. He now looked at market dips not with fear, but with a recognition of opportunity, a chance to buy the same assets at a temporary discount. His health, both physical and mental, reached a new plateau. The constant, low-grade financial anxiety that had been the background hum of his adult life was simply gone. It had been replaced by a deep, resonant calm. He slept 8 hours a night, deeply and dreamlessly. His daily walks became longer, more meditative. He started practicing mindfulness, not as a fad, but as a way to inhabit the present moment fully, unburdened by past financial regrets or future financial fears. The peace he had purchased with his discipline was now paying compound interest in his quality of life. He was healthier, happier, and more present than he had ever been. He decided to conduct a grand review, not just of his finances, but of his entire journey. He laid out his original notebook, the one with the trembling question, "What if I start with $100? He looked at the pages of painstaking budgeting, the lists of leaks, the early, fearful entries about small losses. Then he looked at his current portfolio statement, its value now not only fully recovered from the storm, but significantly surpassing its pre-crash high, turbocharged by the investments he'd made at the bottom. He saw the unbroken chain of hundreds of automatic transfers. He wasn't just looking at numbers. He was looking at the fossil record of his own transformation. The timid, anxious man who started this journey was a stranger to him now. The most profound compounding was happening in his character. He had developed what the ancient philosophers called ataraxia, a state of serene calmness, free from worry and distress. He was patient because he had proven to himself that patience pays. He was disciplined because he had seen discipline triumph over chaos. He was resilient because he had been tested in fire and had emerged stronger. These weren't just traits. They were earned attributes, compounded over years of consistent action and reinforced by the ultimate stress test. One evening, he met Ben, the librarian, for their regular coffee. Ben listened as Evan shared his reflections on the storm and its aftermath. After a long silence, Ben smiled. "You've graduated, Evan," he said softly. "The money is almost a secondary concern now, isn't it? You've built something the market can never take away." Evan nodded, the truth of the statement settling deep within him. The portfolio was the tangible proof, the scorecard. But the real wealth was intangible. It was the quiet confidence in his own judgment. It was the freedom from fear. It was the blueprint for a life of purpose. The financial compounding was impressive, a mathematical marvel. But the compounding of the self, of his wisdom, his resilience, his peace, was the true miracle. He had set out to build a financial fortress, but in the process, he had rebuilt himself. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that no matter what the markets did next, the man he had become was unshakable. The cathedral was not just in his portfolio, it was within him. The portfolio had long since ceased to be a mere number on a screen. It had become a force, a tangible representation of time, discipline, and compounded energy. And like any significant force, it began to exert a gravitational pull, not just on Evan's own life, but on the space around him. He was entering a new phase of the journey, one he had never anticipated, the architecture of generosity. It began with a small, almost imperceptible shift in his awareness. He was in line at a local coffee shop, the one he still occasionally visited for a treat, and saw a young woman, a student from the nearby community college, nervously counting out change for a scone, her face flushed with embarrassment. The total was $3.50. She was short a quarter. The old Evan, perpetually calculating his own precarious balance, might have looked away. The new Evan felt a surge of something entirely different. Not pity, but a sense of capacity. "I've got it," he said to the barista, handing over his card before the student could protest. Her grateful, flustered thank you was a small thing, but it landed in his soul with significant weight. He had just purchased a $3.50 scone, but the feeling it gave him was worth exponentially more. It was the feeling of agency, of being a source of solution rather than a vessel of scarcity. This incident opened a floodgate of awareness. He started to see the world through a new lens. Not what can I afford, but what good can I enable? His financial security had given him a platform from which he could extend a hand. He began volunteering his time, not in a grand, formal way, but organically. He started helping Ben at the library with their struggling adult literacy program, not as a teacher, but as a patient, encouraging coach for those learning to read. The work was humbling. He saw people wrestling with a fundamental skill he took for granted, and his own financial worries shrank to their proper insignificance. He was paying forward the patience he had learned from the market, offering it now to a man in his 50s, slowly sounding out words from a children's book. His giving evolved from spontaneous acts to a structured, intentional part of his financial plan. He created a new category in his budget: generosity. He started small, allocating 1% of his investment contributions to a separate, high-yield savings account he nicknamed his Catalyst Fund. This fund was not for him. It was a dedicated pool of capital for making small, meaningful impacts. He didn't just give to large, faceless charities. He practiced what he called microphilanthropy. He paid for the grocery order of the elderly man behind him in line when he saw him hesitating over a bill. He anonymously bought new uniforms for the struggling high school soccer team his neighbor's son played on. He left an outrageously large tip for a harried waitress who was clearly having a terrible day, with a note that simply said, "You're doing great." Each act was a secret joy, a private dividend that his portfolio paid out in human connection. He was learning that money, when divorced from desperation, could be a tool for injecting kindness into the world. The compounding was no longer just financial. It was emotional and social. The positive energy he put out seemed to generate its own returns, enriching his life in ways a bank statement never could. This new dimension of his financial life forced him to confront deeper questions about his life design blueprint. What was the ultimate purpose of this freedom he was building? Was it solely for his own comfort and leisure? The storm had shown him the value of community. Now, prosperity was showing him the responsibility that came with it. He began to research effective altruism, not to become a major donor, but to understand how to make his modest contributions as impactful as possible. He learned that a few $100s could provide clean water for a village for a year, or fund deworming treatments for hundreds of children, dramatically improving their life outcomes. His Catalyst Fund suddenly felt like a lever that could move the world in tiny, imperceptible, but very real ways. This perspective fundamentally altered his relationship with enough. The old, scarcity-driven version of himself always felt he needed more, a higher salary, a bigger portfolio. The new version, the architect of generosity, began to see a ceiling, a point of sufficiency beyond which additional wealth would have diminishing returns on his personal happiness, but increasing potential for external good. He wasn't there yet, but for the first time, he could envision a future where his primary financial focus would shift from accumulation to distribution. He could be a conduit, a channel through which the powerful force of compounding capital could flow to alleviate a tiny fraction of the world's suffering. This didn't make him reckless. In fact, it made him more committed than ever to his long-term plan. A larger, more robust portfolio meant a larger, more robust Catalyst Fund in the future. His discipline now had a dual purpose: securing his own freedom and amplifying his capacity for generosity. Every dollar he saved and invested was no longer just a vote for his future self. It was a vote for a future where he could be a net positive, a source of quiet good. He started sharing this philosophy cautiously on the long path. He created a thread titled The Generosity Portfolio. He wrote about the psychological shift, the Catalyst Fund, and the joy of microphilanthropy. The response was overwhelming. Many members had never connected their financial journey to the concept of giving. They had been so focused on survival and escape that generosity felt like a luxury for a later, distant day. Evan's post reframed it as an integral part of the journey itself, a source of meaning that could be integrated right now, at any level. Members started sharing their own small stories of giving, creating a ripple effect of positivity through the community. Patient Oak wrote about buying a new winter coat for the child of a struggling single mother at her school. Riverstone shared how he now used a portion of his dividend income to fund scholarships at his local community college. Evan saw that he was no longer just building a personal financial structure. He was helping to build an ethos. The community was evolving from a support group for wealth builders into a network of future benefactors, each committed to using their hard-won financial security to make their own small corner of the world a little brighter. The cathedral he was building was developing stained glass windows, each one depicting a story of quiet, anonymous kindness. One Saturday, while volunteering at the library, his student, a man named Carl, finally laboriously read an entire page from a beginner's book without help. The look of sheer, unadulterated triumph on Carl's face was more valuable than any stock dividend. In that moment, Evan understood the full, beautiful geometry of his journey. The discipline with money had given him security. The security had given him peace. The peace had given him the capacity for patience. And that patience, given freely to another, had yielded a return of pure human joy. The circle was complete. The portfolio had, in its own indirect way, bought that moment for Carl. It was the most profound compounding of all. Evan Carter, the investor, had become Evan Carter, the architect of generosity, and he knew that this was the most important and rewarding structure he would ever build. A strange and wonderful quietude descended upon Evan's life. The frantic striving, the anxious calculations, the desperate need to prove himself. It had all evaporated, leaving behind a profound and resonant stillness. He had entered a phase he could only describe as the symphony of enough. It was a state not of resignation, but of deep, satisfying completion. The individual instruments of his life, work, health, relationships, finances, purpose, were no longer playing discordant, competing tunes. They had fallen into a harmonious and beautiful arrangement. This symphony first manifested in his daily routine. His mornings, once a frantic race against the clock, were now a sacred ritual. He woke without an alarm. His body naturally synced with the dawn. He would brew his coffee and sit not with his laptop, but with a book of poetry or a blank journal. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. It was in this silence that he could hear the soft, steady hum of his portfolio working in the background, a constant bass note of security that allowed the melody of his present moment to be sweet and unhurried. He had reached a point where checking his balance was an act of casual curiosity, not existential dread. The number was what it was. It was enough. His relationship with material possessions completed its final transformation. He wasn't just a minimalist. He was a curator of a life free from the tyranny of things. Every object in his apartment had a purpose or brought him genuine joy. A single, beautiful ceramic bowl he used for everything from salads to keys. A small, original painting by a local artist he'd saved up for. His books, well-loved and often reread. He felt a deep appreciation for the quality and utility of what he owned, and a complete absence of desire for anything more. The advertising that once whispered of inadequacy now sounded like a foreign language. He was immune. The feeling of enough was a fortress, and he was safe inside its walls. This sense of sufficiency bled into his career with even greater force. A new manager, young and aggressively ambitious, took over his department. She instituted a series of performance-enhancing initiatives, mandatory overtime, constant monitoring of call metrics, team-building exercises that felt like forced fun. The old Evan would have been crushed by this, feeling trapped and powerless. The new Evan observed it with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist. He did his job well and efficiently, but he refused to internalize the stress. He declined the overtime, citing prior commitments. He participated in the team building with a gentle, unshakable calm that seemed to baffle his new manager. He was polite but immovable. His financial runway gave him the courage to set unassailable boundaries. He was living the reality that his time and peace were more valuable than any bonus tied to burnout. He was, in the most peaceful way possible, unmanageable. And because he was competent and reliable within his defined hours, there was little anyone could do about it. The symphony of enough played its most beautiful movement in his relationships. Freed from the need to impress or compete, he found his interactions becoming more authentic, more generous. He became a better listener. He found joy in celebrating other people's successes without a hint of comparison. He could be truly present for a friend in crisis, because his own mind wasn't buzzing with a low-level hum of personal financial anxiety. His calm was a resource he could now offer to others. He started hosting simple, monthly potluck dinners at his apartment. There was no grand theme, no expensive showmanship, just good food, good conversation, and the easy comfort of people connecting without pretense. His home became a sanctuary of enough, a place where people felt they could simply be. He began to explore the outer edges of his life design blueprint. With the core of his financial security solidifying, he allowed himself to dream bigger about what his freedom would actually look like. It wasn't about idleness. It was about alignment. He started taking a woodworking class at the community center, not to build a new career, but because the act of creating something tangible with his hands felt deeply satisfying. The smell of sawdust, the focus required to make a precise cut, the slow emergence of a form from a raw piece of wood. It was a meditation. It was another instrument joining his symphony. He volunteered more regularly at the library and found he had a knack for explaining complex concepts in simple terms. He wondered if, one day, he could teach a basic financial literacy class there, helping others find the path that had saved him. The concept of time itself stretched and softened. The frantic countdown to retirement was replaced by a rich, expansive present. He was no longer killing time at a job he disliked. He was investing his time in building a life he loved, piece by piece. The future was no longer a distant shore he was desperately swimming towards. It was a horizon that was gracefully unfolding before him with each passing day. He had decoupled his self-worth from his productivity, and in doing so, had become more productive in the things that truly mattered to him. One evening, during one of his potluck dinners, a friend was venting about the crushing stress of his mortgage, his car payments, his desperate need for a promotion. The room was filled with sympathetic nods. Evan listened, and when his friend was finished, he spoke, not with advice, but with a simple statement of his own reality. "I remember that feeling," he said quietly. "It's like being in a cage. I decided a few years ago that I was going to find a way out of the cage. It started with just $100. He didn't preach. He didn't try to convert. He simply shared his story, the story of the mirror and the mountain, the storm and the anchor, the architecture of generosity." The room fell silent, not out of awkwardness, but out of captivated attention. He was describing a reality that felt both impossible and deeply desirable to them. After everyone had left, he stood at his window, looking out at the city. The lights no longer represented competition or his own smallness. They were just lights, each one a life, a story. He felt a part of it all, yet beautifully separate. He had built his own world within the world, a world governed not by fear and scarcity, but by sufficiency and purpose. The symphony was playing softly, a composition of his own design. The frantic, dissonant noise of his past had been orchestrated into a harmonious whole. He had arrived at enough, and he discovered that it was not a destination, but a way of traveling. It was the most luxurious and peaceful feeling he had ever known. The journey was far from over, but the desperate striving was. He was no longer building a cathedral to escape a storm. He was living in it, appreciating the quiet beauty of its arches and the way the light fell through its windows. It was more than enough. It was everything. The potluck dinner had been a quiet watershed. In the days that followed, Evan found himself not just content, but brimming with a new kind of energy. The symphony of enough had provided the harmony, but now a new melody was emerging, one with a more outward-facing rhythm. He had shared his story, and in the telling, he had seen a spark of recognition, a flicker of hope in the eyes of his friends. It was the same spark he had felt years ago watching that first online video. He realized that his journey had endowed him with something more valuable than his portfolio, a legacy of understanding. And a legacy, by its very nature, is meant to be passed on. This wasn't about becoming a guru or a financial influencer. The very thought was anathema to his quiet, deliberate nature. It was more organic, more personal. It began with his friend Leo, the artist. A week after the potluck, Leo showed up at his door, unannounced, his face etched with a familiar anxiety. "That thing you said about the $100, Leo began, shifting his weight. I think I'm ready to stop being broke. But I don't know how. The numbers, they scare me." Evan didn't launch into a lecture about index funds. He simply invited him in, brewed 2 cups of tea, and pulled out his original, battered notebook. He showed Leo the first, trembling entry. He showed him the pages of leaks, the emotional bookkeeping from the storm. He made it human, messy, and accessible. He wasn't showing Leo a finished blueprint. He was showing him the rough, hand-drawn sketches from which the cathedral was built. He helped Leo open a brokerage account that very afternoon, guiding him to set up an automatic transfer of just $25 a week, an amount so small it felt painless. "Don't think of it as investing," Evan told him. "Think of it as planting a single seed. Your only job for the first year is to not dig up." Leo left not with a complex strategy, but with a single, manageable action and the comforting knowledge that someone he trusted had walked this path before him. This single act of mentorship felt more significant than any dividend payment. He had become a guide, a translator for the intimidating language of finance. He started a small, private blog, not for the world, but for his inner circle. He called it The Quiet Path. He posted simple, parable-like stories drawn from his own experience. One post was titled The Gardener and the Speculator, contrasting the patient work of compounding with the frantic digging of a gambler. Another was The Three Enemies: fear, impatience, and ego. He wrote in plain language, stripping away the jargon. He received messages from friends of friends, a cousin, a former co-worker. The ripple was spreading. His mother, who had always viewed the stock market with deep suspicion, called him. "Your Aunt Carol showed me something you wrote," she said, her voice a mix of curiosity and caution, "about how it's not about getting rich, but about getting free." They talked for an hour. Evan patiently explained it not as a gamble, but as a way of owning a tiny piece of the companies she used every day: the grocery store, the utility company, the brand of soap she bought. He helped her open a starter account, funding it with a small portion of her savings. The act of guiding his mother, of demystifying this world for the woman who had taught him so much, felt like closing a profound generational loop. He was breaking a cycle of financial fear that had stretched back for decades. He formalized this impulse in his own quiet way. He partnered with Ben at the library to propose a workshop series, Financial Foundations for the Rest of Us. It was explicitly not for day traders or aspiring millionaires. It was for the Leos of the world, for the single parents, the gig workers, the artists, the people who felt locked out of the financial system. The library provided the space. Evan provided the curriculum, which was really just a story structured into 4 sessions: Taming the Money Monster, Budgeting and Mindset, The Magic of Small Starts, Compounding and Automation, Riding the Roller Coaster, Psychology and Volatility, and Building Your Future, Your Way, Defining Enough, and Life Design. The first workshop had a turnout of 12 people. They were hesitant, their body language defensive. Evan began not with a spreadsheet, but by asking, "What's the one word that comes to mind when you think about money?" The answers came in a weary chorus: stress, fear, anxiety, confusion. He nodded. "Me too," he said, "for a long, long time." And then he began to tell his story. He saw shoulders relax. He saw nods of recognition. He was not an expert on a pedestal. He was a fellow traveler who had found a map. He watched as one of his students, a woman named Maria, who worked 2 jobs to support her kids, had her light bulb moment when he explained the rule of 72. "You mean, if I just wait, my money can work for me?" she asked, her eyes wide with the revelation. "While I'm sleeping, while I'm at my other job." That shift in perspective, from money as a problem to be managed to money as a quiet, generative partner, was more valuable than any specific stock tip. He was witnessing the birth of agency. This work, this legacy of understanding, became the capstone of his symphony of enough. His own financial independence was no longer a solitary pursuit. It was the foundation from which he could help others build their own. The satisfaction he derived from seeing Maria open her first investment account, or from getting a text from Leo saying, "Didn't touch the seed this month," was a form of wealth that felt infinite and endlessly renewable. He was compounding hope. He was compounding knowledge. He was compounding freedom, not just for himself, but for a slowly expanding circle of people around him. He realized that the ultimate dividend of his journey was not the ability to stop working, but the ability to work on what truly mattered. Teaching, guiding, empowering, this was his real calling. The portfolio had given him the freedom to discover it and the time to pursue it. He wasn't just leaving a legacy of money. He was leaving a legacy of mindset. He had learned that the most powerful inheritance you can give someone is not a sum of money, but the understanding of how to build it themselves. And as he stood before his small class at the library, watching the lights of comprehension turn on in their eyes, Evan Carter knew, with absolute certainty, that he had finally, truly, arrived. The legacy was alive, and it was just beginning to grow. The library workshops, the quiet mentorship, the growing Catalyst Fund. These were the visible fruits of Evan's journey. But beneath them lay something deeper, an unseen foundation that had been quietly solidifying for years. It was a psychological infrastructure so robust that it made the financial portfolio seem almost incidental. This was the foundation of a truly free mind. He first became aware of it during a citywide power outage. A sudden summer storm knocked out electricity for 12 hours. While his neighbors fretted about spoiled food, dead phones, and stifling heat, Evan was unperturbed. He lit the emergency candles he kept in a drawer, read a book by their gentle light, and enjoyed the unusual silence. The potential financial loss of the food in his fridge was a triviality, a rounding error in his monthly budget. The old Evan would have spiraled into anxiety, calculating the cost of replacing everything. The new Evan simply accepted it as the cost of living in a world of weather. His peace was no longer conditional on external circumstances. It was endogenous, generated from within. This unshakable calm began to inform his every decision, large and small. When his car, a reliable but aging vehicle, finally needed a repair that cost more than its value, he didn't experience it as a crisis. It was a data point. He calmly researched his options, weighed the cost of a used car against the ongoing repair costs of the old one, and paid cash for a modest, dependable replacement. There was no debt, no panic, no feeling of being set back. It was simply a logistical problem to be solved with the resources he had deliberately accumulated. The event was a non-event, emotionally. This, he realized, was the ultimate luxury, the ability to handle life's inevitable emergencies without emotional turmoil. His relationship with the future underwent its final, most liberating transformation. He stopped waiting for his life to begin when he reached some arbitrary net worth figure. His life was already happening, and it was rich and full. The future was no longer a separate country he was trying to emigrate to. It was a seamless extension of his present. He was living his retirement now, in the sense that he was already doing the things that brought him meaning and joy. His woodworking, his volunteering, his mentorship. The financial independence he was building was simply the guarantee that he would never be forced to stop. This allowed him to engage with his day job in a way that was almost playful. He started seeing it as a fascinating study in human psychology and organizational dynamics. The ambitious new manager was no longer a source of stress, but a case study in ineffective leadership. The office politics became a mildly entertaining drama he could observe without needing to participate in. He was there by choice, not by desperation. This psychological distance made him, ironically, more effective. He was clear-headed, creative, and unafraid to speak truth to power because the threat of job loss had lost its fangs. He had reached the pinnacle of career success. He was indispensable precisely because he didn't need the job. He began to experiment with what he called freedom rehearsals. He would take a random Wednesday off, not for any special reason, but just to practice being free. He would spend the day wandering through museums, taking long walks in parks he'd never visited, or simply reading in a coffee shop for hours. These days were not about productivity or checking items off a bucket list. They were about savoring the texture of unstructured time, of reminding himself that his days were his own to design. Each rehearsal was a small, delicious taste of the life he was building, and it reinforced his commitment to the path. This deep-seated security began to radiate from him, affecting his relationships in subtle ways. He became a more attractive friend and confidant because he had no agenda. People sensed that he wasn't seeking anything from them. Not validation, not networking opportunities, not gossip. He was simply present. His calm was contagious. Friends started coming to him, not for financial advice, but for life advice. They sensed the clarity of a man who had sorted out his fundamental survival needs and could now see other problems with unclouded eyes. The most profound aspect of this unseen foundation was the death of envy. He could look at a former classmate's social media post from a luxury vacation and feel genuine happiness for them, completely untainted by jealousy or a sense of lack. He knew the price of such a vacation, not just in dollars, but in the time and stress required to earn those dollars. He had made a different calculation. His choice was a modest apartment and a soul-deep peace. Theirs was a 5-star hotel, and he suspected a 5-star level of underlying stress to maintain that lifestyle. He no longer saw the shiny object. He saw the hidden costs. He was free from the tyranny of comparison. He started a new section in his life design blueprint titled The Unseen Foundation. In it, he didn't list assets or income streams. He listed states of being, equanimity, presence, freedom from comparison, non-attachment to outcomes, generosity of spirit. He tracked his progress, not in dollars, but in his ability to maintain these states during life's inevitable irritations and triumphs. This was the real net worth, the balance that truly mattered. One afternoon, during a freedom rehearsal, he was sitting on a park bench, watching children play. A thought occurred to him with the force of a revelation. He had spent the first half of his adult life building a financial foundation so that he could spend the second half building a philosophical one. The money had been the necessary groundwork, the literal concrete, so that this more delicate and beautiful structure, a life of wisdom and peace, could be built upon it. The portfolio was the cellar. The unseen foundation was the grand hall where life was actually lived. He realized that this was the final, and most important, lesson of his journey. Financial independence wasn't the end goal. It was the gateway. The real work, the most rewarding work, began on the other side of that gate. It was the work of building a mind so strong, a spirit so resilient, and a heart so open that no market crash, no job loss, no life event could ever truly shake it. He had spent years meticulously constructing his financial fortress, only to discover that the greatest security lay not within its walls, but within himself. The storm had proven the fortress was strong. Now, he was learning he could live happily outside of it, enjoying the sunshine, completely unafraid of the weather. The foundation was unseen, but it was everywhere, holding up his world. The threads of Evan's life, once tangled, frayed, and knotted with anxiety, were now being woven into a tapestry of startling clarity and beauty. The individual strands of his journey, financial discipline, emotional resilience, community, generosity, and philosophical peace, were no longer separate. They were interlacing, each one strengthening and giving depth to the others, creating a picture far richer than the sum of its parts. He was no longer just living a better life. He was becoming a different person, and the world was beginning to reflect that change back to him. This weaving became most apparent in his creative pursuits. His woodworking, once a hobby, began to evolve. He wasn't just making shelves and small boxes anymore. He started designing and building pieces that told a story. He built a beautiful, simple desk for the library's literacy program, carving the words, "The first word is the hardest," in a subtle, elegant script along one edge. He used wood salvage from a fallen oak tree in his neighborhood to create a series of small, smooth, worry stones that he gave to friends and students, telling them, "Hold this when the market gets noisy." It's a reminder that real growth is slow and solid. His financial stability had given him the mental space for his creativity to flourish, and his creativity was now becoming a vehicle for his philosophy. The artisan and the investor had merged. His life design blueprint was no longer a static document, but a living, breathing entity. He began to host quarterly blueprint evenings at his apartment. He invited a small, rotating group of friends, students from his library workshops, and members of his online community who lived nearby. There was no agenda other than to share, reflect, and refine. They would discuss their wins, not just financial, but personal, setting a boundary at work, finally starting a meditation practice, having a difficult conversation with a family member from a place of calm. They also shared their leaks, where fear or old habits were still causing friction. The Catalyst Fund was now a communal pool, with the group voting on small, local projects to support, a community garden, supplies for an underfunded classroom, a month's rent for a family-facing eviction. The act of giving had become a collective, joyful decision. Evan found that his role in these gatherings was not as a leader, but as a weaver. He would listen to Leo talk about the pride he felt seeing his seed investment grow, and then connect it to Maria's story of finally feeling like she wasn't just surviving, but building. He wove their individual narratives into the larger tapestry of the group, showing them how their separate journeys were part of a shared human struggle for agency and peace. He was creating a microculture, a small society built on the principles he had tested in the laboratory of his own life. This tapestry began to extend into his family. His mother, emboldened by her small foray into investing, started a similar catalyst fund of her own with her church group, focusing on helping single mothers with emergency expenses. She called Evan one evening, her voice bubbling with excitement. "We just paid for a car repair for a young woman, so she wouldn't lose her job. It was your idea, son. It feels better than any dividend." The legacy was not just spreading. It was mutating and adapting, taking on new forms and new contexts. He had given his mother not just a financial tool, but a new identity as a problem solver and a benefactor. Professionally, the weaving created a strange and wonderful paradox. His utter lack of ambition for corporate advancement, his deep-seated peace, made him a magnet for interesting opportunities. Senior managers, weary of the political climbers, started seeking him out for his clear-eyed, unvarnished perspective on projects. He was offered a role as an internal consultant, a troubleshooter who would float between departments and diagnose systemic issues. The role came with more responsibility, but also more autonomy and a significant pay raise. The old Evan would have seized it out of a desperate need for validation. The new Evan considered it carefully. He saw that it aligned with his skills and his desire to solve complex problems, and the autonomy meant he could protect his freedom rehearsals and his volunteer work. He accepted the role, not as a step up a ladder, but as a lateral move into a more interesting patch of the garden. He was being paid more to be more himself. His health and physicality became another vibrant thread in the tapestry. The calmness in his mind manifested as a new grace in his body. He took up Tai Chi in the park at dawn, the slow, flowing movements, a physical expression of the patience he had cultivated with his finances. He felt stronger, more grounded, more connected to the physical world. He started a small vegetable garden on his fire escape, learning the slow, patient rhythms of growth from seed to harvest. Tending to his tomatoes and herbs became a daily meditation, a tangible reminder that all meaningful growth requires consistent, patient care and a faith in processes you cannot always see. The tapestry was even altering his experience of the city itself. Baltimore was no longer just the backdrop to his life. It became his partner. He knew the best benches for reading, the quietest corners of the art museum, the diner that made the perfect grilled cheese. He became a regular at a tiny, family-owned hardware store, where the owner now knew him by name and would offer advice on his woodworking projects. His financial independence hadn't made him want to escape his surroundings. It had made him want to sink deeper into them, to become a rooted, contributing part of the ecosystem. One evening, looking at the tapestry of his life as it now stood, he had a final, culminating insight. The goal had never been to reach a finish line called financial independence. The goal had been to use the process of building financial independence as a tool for personal alchemy. The discipline with money was the fire that had burned away his fear and impatience. The community was the water that had cooled his temper and quenched his loneliness. The generosity was the air that had expanded his spirit. And the philosophical peace was the earth that now provided an unshakable foundation. He had set out to build a portfolio, but he had ended up rebuilding his very soul. The tapestry on the loom was no longer just a depiction of a successful financial plan. It was a portrait of a man who had become whole, and he knew, with a calm certainty, that the weaving would continue, with ever more intricate and beautiful patterns, for the rest of his days. The transformation was now complete, not just within Evan, but in the very atmosphere he inhabited. He had moved beyond building a life. He was now stewarding a personal ecosystem, a delicate, thriving ecology of enough. This was a state of dynamic equilibrium where every action, every resource, every relationship existed in a balanced, self-reinforcing loop. The frantic energy of acquisition had been replaced by the serene rhythm of stewardship. He saw this ecology first in his finances, which had become a closed-loop system. His income flowed in, a portion was automatically diverted to his investments, the growth sector of his ecosystem, a portion to his catalyst fund, the pollination sector, and the rest sustained his modest needs. The dividends and growth from his investments then fed back into the system, increasing its resilience and its capacity for generosity. Money was no longer a linear path from earning to spending. It was a nutrient cycle, circulating and enriching every part of his life. He was no longer a consumer of resources, but a custodian of capital. This ecological mindset reshaped his consumption. He became obsessed with waste streams, not just of trash, but of energy, time, and attention. He installed a simple compost bin on his fire escape, turning his food scraps into rich soil for his vegetable garden. The vegetables from the garden then reduced his grocery bill and his food waste, completing another perfect loop. He applied the same principle to information, ruthlessly pruning sources of mental pollution, the angry news channels, the social media feeds that trigger comparison, and cultivating sources of mental nourishment, like his book club and philosophical discussions with Ben. His attention, he realized, was the most precious resource in his ecosystem, and he guarded its purity with the vigilance of a conservationist. His role at work evolved into that of a corporate ecologist. In his new troubleshooting role, he didn't just fix problems. He diagnosed systemic inefficiencies, the resource leaks and toxic cultures that were draining the company's energy and morale. He proposed solutions that created better feedback loops between departments, reduced bureaucratic friction, and gave employees more autonomy. He was, in effect, trying to help the company achieve its own version of enough, where it could thrive without the constant, frantic burnout of its people. His reputation grew not as a fixer, but as a healer of broken systems. The ecology of enough transformed his understanding of community. He saw his neighborhood not as a collection of separate households, but as an interconnected web. He started a tool lending library in his apartment building's basement, a simple rack where neighbors could borrow a drill or a wrench instead of buying their own. This small act reduced collective consumption and fostered unexpected connections. He organized a Skillshare Saturday where neighbors taught each other basic carpentry, cooking, and budgeting. Leo taught a session on the art of the small start, and Maria taught fear-free finance for families. The flow of knowledge and resources within his immediate community created a resilience that no individual household could achieve alone. His personal ecosystem was merging with the larger one around him. His health became the most intimate expression of this ecology. His daily Tai Chi in the park was no longer just an exercise. It was a way of harmonizing his internal energy with the energy of the natural world. His walks became listening tours, where he paid attention to the birds, the wind, the subtle changes in the seasons. He learned to identify the native plants, pushing through cracks in the pavement. He felt his own biological rhythms syncing with the larger rhythms of the earth. The anxiety that had once coiled in his gut had been replaced by a deep, somatic peace. He was not just in the environment. He was of it. This ecological awareness brought a new dimension to his life design blueprint. He added a new layer, environmental impact. He calculated his carbon footprint and set about systematically reducing it, not out of guilt, but as a logical extension of his philosophy of enough. He reduced his meat consumption, switched to a green energy provider, and became a zealous advocate for public transportation. He saw the climate crisis as the ultimate failure of the more mentality on a global scale, and his personal ecology was his small, defiant stand for balance. The Catalyst Fund evolved into a restoration fund. He and his group began directing their resources toward local environmental causes. They funded the planting of a native species garden in a neglected corner of a public park. They bought and distributed reusable water bottles to a local school to reduce plastic waste. Their giving was no longer just about alleviating immediate human suffering. It was about investing in the long-term health and beauty of the ecosystem they all shared. Their generosity had developed an environmental conscience. One Saturday, he led his blueprint group on a silent walk through a nearby forest preserve. For 2 hours, they didn't speak. They simply walked, observing the intricate interdependencies of the forest. The fungi connecting the trees, the insects pollinating the flowers, the decay feeding the new growth. At the end of the walk, as they stood by a slow-moving creek, Evan finally spoke, his voice quiet against the sounds of the water and the wind. "This is the model," he said. "No single part takes more than it needs. Every output becomes an input for something else. There is no waste. There is only transformation and balance. This is what we're trying to build in our own lives. An ecology of enough." The understanding that settled over the group was palpable. It wasn't just a financial strategy anymore. It was a holistic philosophy for living on a finite planet. It was about finding their rightful, humble place in the grand, interconnected web of life and acting in a way that honored that connection. Evan returned to his apartment that evening, the smell of damp earth and leaves still on his clothes. He looked around his small, ordered space. The compost bin on the fire escape, the tool lending library in the basement, the financial statements showing a self-sustaining nutrient cycle, the calendar filled with community skill shares and restoration projects. It was all connected. He had started with a simple question about $100 and had ended up here, as a steward, a healer, a tiny but conscious part of a vast, living system. The ecology of enough was thriving, and he knew that his most important work was simply to tend to it, with patience, gratitude, and a deep, abiding love for the beautiful, balanced whole. The ecology of enough was not a destination, but a state of being, a perpetual, graceful unfolding. Evan had long since stopped measuring his progress in years or dollars, and had begun measuring it in the quality of his attention, the depth of his connections, and the quiet, ever-expanding sense of rightness that permeated his days. The frantic energy of building had been replaced by the serene art of tending. He was no longer the architect of his life. He was its gardener, and he was watching with wonder as seeds he had planted years ago were now blooming in unexpected and beautiful ways. This unfolding was most evident in the lives of those he had touched. Leo, the artist, had his first small gallery show. The theme was patience, and the centerpiece was a series of sculptures made from reclaimed wood, each piece representing a year of his financial and creative journey. One sculpture, titled The Seed, was a simple, beautifully polished burl of oak. Next to it, a card read, "For Evan, who taught me that a seed holds entire forests within it." Evan walked through the gallery, his heart swelling with a pride so pure it brought tears to his eyes. He wasn't just seeing Leo's art. He was witnessing the flowering of a human spirit that had been trapped in the thorns of financial chaos. The legacy was no longer an abstract concept. It was hanging on a gallery wall, solid and real. Maria, from his library workshop, used her newfound financial stability and confidence to transition from her two dead-end jobs to a single, stable position with benefits at a local nonprofit. She became a vocal advocate for financial literacy in her community, organizing her own small workshops at her church. She called Evan one evening, her voice crackling with excitement. "They're listening," she said. "The women in my community, they never thought this was for them. But when they see me, someone who looks like them and talks like them, they start to believe it's possible." The ripple was becoming a wave, and Evan was standing on the shore, watching it spread, his own small stone of an idea now generating forces he could never have imagined. His blueprint evenings had organically multiplied. Other members had started hosting their own in different neighborhoods, creating a decentralized network of small groups dedicated to living intentionally. They shared resources, ideas, and successes through a simple, private online forum. They called themselves the Tenders. They weren't a corporation or a formal nonprofit. They were a mycelial network of change, spreading quietly beneath the surface of the city. Evan's role was now simply that of an elder statesman, a wise node in the network, offering gentle guidance when asked, but mostly just marveling at the collective intelligence and compassion of the group he had helped spark. Professionally, the unfolding took the form of a quiet revolution. His work as a corporate ecologist had yielded such dramatic improvements in morale and efficiency that he was asked to design a company-wide well-being program. He called it the Sustainable Performance Initiative. It was based entirely on the principles of his own journey, encouraging employees to define their enough, teaching them the basics of financial resilience to reduce background anxiety, creating focused blocks of uninterrupted work time, and rewarding outcomes rather than hours logged. The program was initially met with skepticism, but as participation grew, the entire culture of the company began to shift. Absenteeism dropped. Collaboration improved. The frantic, burned-out energy was replaced by a calm, focused hum. Evan had successfully inoculated a small part of the corporate world with the virus of enough. His personal life unfolded into a deeper, more textured tapestry of simple pleasures. His woodworking evolved into a form of meditation. He spent weeks on a single piece, a rocking chair for Ben, who was about to become a grandfather. He selected the wood with care, joined the pieces with painstaking precision, and finished it with a hand-rubbed oil that brought out the deep, warm glow of the grain. The act of creation was no longer about the final product, but about the love and attention he could pour into every moment of the process. Giving the chair to a tearful Ben was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. He began a new practice, gratitude mapping. Each evening, he would take a large sheet of paper and draw a small, simple icon for every moment of the day he was grateful for. A steaming mug of coffee, a shared laugh with a coworker, the sight of a cardinal on his fire escape, the successful transfer of his automatic investment. Over time, these maps became complex, beautiful mandalas of a life richly lived. They were the antithesis of a to-do list. They were a ta-done, list, a celebration of the abundance that was already present. The most profound unfolding, however, was happening in his relationship with time itself. The future no longer felt like something he was hurtling towards or preparing for. It felt like something that was emerging gently from the fertile soil of his well-tended present. He stopped making 5-year plans and instead focused on seasonal intentions. What do you want to nurture this spring? What did you want to release this fall? This rhythmic, cyclical way of planning felt more natural, more in tune with the ecology of enough. He realized one day, with a start, that he had completely forgotten the exact figure of his financial independence number. The number that had once been a holy grail, a digital promised land, was now irrelevant. He had already achieved the independence that mattered. Independence from fear, from comparison, from the desperate need for more. The money in his portfolio was now like the mature trees in a forest, a stable, self-perpetuating system that provided shelter and sustenance without requiring constant, anxious oversight. On the 10th anniversary of his first $100 investment, he didn't throw a party or even check his portfolio balance. He spent the day in silence. He meditated, walked in the park, worked on a new woodworking project, and cooked himself a simple, beautiful meal. In the evening, he lit a candle and looked at his very first gratitude map from years ago, with its few, sparse icons. Then he looked at the complex, blooming mandala from the previous night. The difference was staggering. It was the visual record of an unfolding, of a life moving from scarcity to profound, overflowing abundance. He understood now that the journey would never be over. There would be new seasons, new challenges, new layers of understanding to unfold. But the frantic striving was gone, replaced by a joyful participation in a mystery that was forever revealing itself. Evan Carter, the gardener, smiled. The seeds had been sown. The ecology was thriving. And the unfolding was the most beautiful part of all. The unfolding had reached a kind of escape velocity. Evan's influence was no longer a series of ripples, but had become a constellation, a pattern of bright points of light, each representing a life touched and transformed, all connected by the invisible lines of shared philosophy. He was no longer just tending his own garden. He was living in a galaxy of his own making, a cosmos where the physics of enough had replaced the frantic gravity of more. This constellation became visible to him during a citywide festival of enough, an idea that had emerged from the decentralized tenders network. What began as a small potluck in a park had grown into a city-sanctioned event with thousands of attendees. There were workshops on mending clothes instead of discarding them, on debt-free degrees, on mindfulness and urban gardening. Food was shared from communal pots. Local musicians played acoustic sets. The entire event was run on a gift economy and volunteerism. There were no corporate sponsors, no vendors selling things. It was a temporary autonomous zone, a physical manifestation of the ecology of enough. As Evan walked through the festival, he was recognized, not as a celebrity, but as a founding star in their constellation. A young couple stopped him, their eyes shining. "We read your Quiet Path blog," the woman said. "We're debt-free because of you. We're here because of you." A man running a workshop on beekeeping waved him over. "Your Catalyst Fund helped me buy my first hives," he exclaimed. "Come, taste the honey." Leo had a booth displaying his patient sculptures. Maria was leading a packed workshop in a tent, her voice confident and clear as she explained budgeting to a rapt audience. Ben was in the silent Reading Grove, a quiet area he had championed. Evan stood in the center of the festival, the hum of joyful, purposeful activity washing over him. He was not the conductor of this orchestra. He was a member of the audience, witnessing a symphony he had only written the first few notes for. The constellation had formed itself. He saw that his true legacy was not a set of teachings, but a pattern of thinking, a meme of sufficiency and peace that had replicated, adapted, and was now thriving in the wild. This realization prompted a final, profound shift in his own identity. The last vestiges of the investor persona, the builder, the gardener, dissolved. He was simply Evan. A man, a node in a network, a star in a constellation. The labels he had worn, even the positive ones, felt like unnecessary costumes. He had achieved the ultimate freedom, freedom from his own story. He no longer needed to see himself as the hero of a financial comeback narrative. He could just be a man walking through a park, a man talking with friends, a man sipping tea. The ego that had been both the driver and the burden of his early journey had quietly retired. His work with a large corporation reached its natural conclusion. The Sustainable Performance Initiative was now embedded in the company's culture, run by a team of internal champions. He had become obsolete, and he celebrated it as his greatest professional success. He resigned, not to retire, but to make space. The salary, the title, the business cards, they were all artifacts of a world he had gently departed from. His personal ecosystem was now so robust that the loss of the income was a non-event, a minor adjustment in the nutrient flow. With this new, vast expanse of open time, he entered a phase of deep, unstructured curiosity. He followed his interests with the meandering focus of a butterfly. He spent a month studying mycology, fascinated by the fungal networks that mirrored his Tinder's group. He audited a philosophy course at the community college, not for a degree, but for the sheer joy of wrestling with big questions in a room of eager minds. He learned to play the harmonica, badly, but with great enthusiasm. His days were not planned. They were discovered. He began to write again, but not for an audience. He started a private journal he called the Book of Unknowing. In it, he explored the paradoxes at the heart of his journey. How the pursuit of control had led him to surrender. How the focus on a future number had brought him into the present moment. How the accumulation of capital had resulted in the dissolution of desire. He wasn't writing to teach anymore. He was writing to understand the mysterious alchemy that had transformed his life. The Catalyst Fund and its communal offspring had grown so large that they formally became a small, registered nonprofit, the Enough Foundation. The board was composed of Leo, Maria, Ben, and other tenders. Evan declined a seat on the board. "It's your constellation now," he told them. "I'm just happy to be Starlight." He knew that for the foundation to truly endure, it needed to orbit its own center of gravity, not his. One autumn evening, he was walking home from the library, a bag of books in his hand. The air was crisp, the sky a deep, clear blue with the first few stars twinkling overhead. He stopped on the bridge overlooking the harbor, the same harbor where he had once wrestled with the rule of 72 and later weathered the storm. He looked at the reflection of the city lights on the dark water, and then up at the emerging stars. He saw it all. The scared young man at the kitchen table, the disciplined investor, the terrified survivor of the crash, the commenter, the weaver, the gardener, the steward, the starlight. Each version of himself was a star in the constellation of his life, each one necessary, each one beautiful. The path had not been a straight line. It had been the drawing of a complex, celestial pattern. He didn't feel pride. He felt gratitude. Gratitude for the struggle. Gratitude for the teachers, both named and anonymous. Gratitude for the community that had held him. Gratitude for the mysterious, intelligent force of compounding that worked on money, on relationships, on wisdom, on peace. Evan Carter stood on the bridge for a long time, a quiet smile on his face, a man completely at home in the universe he had helped co-create. The journey was complete. The constellation was bright, and the most profound truth of all was that it had only just begun. The future was an infinite, star-dusted expanse of gentle, continuous unfolding, and he was ready to explore it, not as a builder or a gardener, but simply as a man in love with the mystery of it all. He turned towards home, the weight of the books in his bag a pleasant anchor, his footsteps light on the path, a single, bright star in a vast and friendly sky. The final scene was not an ending, but a quiet revolution in perspective. Evan had reached the summit of his mountain, only to discover it was not a peak at all, but a vast, open plateau with new horizons in every direction. The frantic energy of ascent was gone, replaced by the deep, resonant hum of being. He had entered a state he could only describe as the eternal return. Not a repetition, but a constant, joyful rediscovery of the same profound truths in ever-deepening contexts. This phase began with a subtle but powerful shift in his daily rituals. His morning coffee was no longer just a caffeine delivery system. It was a sacrament. The act of grinding the beans, the sound of the water boiling, the rich aroma filling his small kitchen. Each step was performed with a mindful attention that transformed the mundane into the miraculous. He wasn't just making coffee. He was practicing the art of presence, a skill he had honed over a decade of financial and spiritual discipline. The $100 investor was now a master of the ordinary, finding universes of meaning in the simple acts of daily life. His work, or what had once been called work, underwent its final metamorphosis. Freed from the need for income, his activities became purely expressionistic. He didn't volunteer at the library. He simply spent time there, becoming a permanent, gentle presence. He was the man who could fix the wobbly chair, who could patiently help a teenager with a research paper, who always had time to listen to Ben's latest ideas. He started a repair cafe in a corner of the community room, where people could bring their broken toasters, torn clothes, and wobbly furniture. He didn't do the repairs for them. He sat with them, guiding their hands, teaching them the principles of mending. He was teaching a philosophy of care, using objects as his textbook. The act of repairing a broken lamp became a lesson in patience, in understanding systems, in the value of preserving what already exists, the core tenets of his entire journey. The Enough Foundation, now thriving under its new leadership, surprised him with a proposal. They wanted to purchase a small, abandoned property on the edge of the city, a dilapidated house with a large, overgrown yard. Their vision was to create a permanent physical home for the ecology of Enough, the Enough House. It would be a community center, a workshop space, a demonstration garden, and a living laboratory for sustainable living. They asked Evan not to run it, but to be its philosopher in residence. His role would be simply to be there, to think, to talk, to weave connections, to embody the principles they were promoting. He accepted, not as a job, but as a calling. The Enough House became his new canvas. He didn't organize the renovation with blueprints and deadlines. He approached it as a slow, collaborative art project. Community members came on weekends. Leo and his artist friends designed beautiful, functional spaces from salvaged materials. Maria's financial literacy group managed the project's tiny budget with radical transparency. The garden was planted by neighborhood children who learned about native species and composting. The house rose not from a construction site, but from a community ritual, each nail hammered with intention, each wall painted with care. It was the physical manifestation of the constellation, a place where the stars could gather. Evan's book of unknowing began to fill with a new kind of writing. He started composing parables, short, poetic stories that captured the essence of his philosophy without a single financial term. One was about two gardeners, one who constantly uprooted his plants to check their growth, and another who trusted the hidden work of the roots and was rewarded with a magnificent harvest. Another was about a river that tried to rush to the ocean, exhausting itself against the rocks, and a river that learned to meander, discovering secret pools and nourishing entire ecosystems on its journey. These stories were circulated among the tenders and read aloud at the Enough House. They became the oral tradition of their movement, a mythology of Enough. His relationship with his own past completed its healing. He took a pilgrimage to his childhood home. He sat on the porch of the small house where his parents had whispered about bills, where the fear of not enough had been the wallpaper of his youth. He felt no anger, no resentment. He felt a deep, compassionate love for the struggling people who had raised him with the tools they had. He understood that his entire journey had been, in part, an act of forgiveness, a way of healing that childhood fear, not just for himself, but for his entire lineage. He had broken the chain, and in doing so, had honored the struggle of every link that came before him. The seasons turned, and with them, Evan's understanding of time deepened into something cyclical and sacred. He saw his life not as a linear path from birth to death, but as a spiral. He was constantly circling back to the same core lessons: patience, trust, community, generosity, but each time at a higher level of understanding. The fear he had faced in the market crash was the same fear he had felt as a child, but he had met it with the resources of a seasoned warrior. The patience he learned with his investments was the same patience he now offered to a struggling reader or a broken chair. It was the eternal return to the essential self, each return revealing a new depth. One evening, during a weekly potluck at the Enough House, a violent thunderstorm rolled in. The power went out. Instead of panic, the community lit every candle and lantern they had. The large, rustic room was bathed in a warm, dancing light. Someone started singing a simple folk song. Others joined in. They spent the evening in the golden glow, telling stories, singing, sharing food from the garden. The storm outside was not an interruption. It was a feature, a reminder of their resilience and their independence from the fragile grids of the outside world. Evan sat in a corner, watching the scene. He saw the faces of his friends, his students, his fellow travelers, illuminated by the candlelight. He saw Leo, calm and centered. He saw Maria, confident and strong. He saw Ben, wise and gentle. He saw a room full of people who had chosen a different way to live, who had built a world within the world, a sanctuary of enough. In that moment, he had his final, culminating insight. The portfolio, the financial independence, the ecology of enough. It had all been a grand, beautiful, necessary detour. A decade-long curriculum designed by life itself to teach him one simple, impossible lesson: how to be fully, completely, joyfully human. The money was the training wheels. The real vehicle was his own awakened heart. The storm passed. The candles burned low. The singing softened into a contented silence. Evan looked around the room, at the constellation of faces he loved, in a house they had built together, and he knew he was home, not in a place, but in a state of being. The journey was over. The journey had just begun. It was the eternal return to the heart of the matter, to the truth that had been waiting for him all along, that you are already enough, and the entire universe is conspiring to help you remember it. And in the quiet, candlelit silence of the Enough House, Evan Carter, the man who started with $100, finally, completely, remembered. The completion of the Enough House did not mark an end, but the opening of a new frontier in Evan's consciousness, a horizon of becoming. This was not about achieving a static state of perfection, but about embracing a perpetual, gentle evolution. The rigid structures of goals and plans had dissolved, replaced by a fluid, trusting participation in the unfolding mystery of existence. He was learning to navigate not by maps, but by the stars of his own deepening intuition. This new horizon first revealed itself in his relationship with his own body. Now in his late 30s, he noticed the subtle changes, the slower recovery from exertion, the first few silver threads in his dark curls. The old Evan might have met these signs with resistance, a frantic attempt to cling to youth. The new Evan observed them with a curious, almost scientific detachment. He began to see his body not as a machine to be maintained, but as a landscape through which he was journeying, with its own weather, its own seasons of vigor and rest. His Tai Chi practice deepened into a silent dialogue with his own aging, a way of listening to the wisdom his body was now offering about pace, acceptance, and the beauty of the autumn years. His role as the philosopher in residence evolved into something even less defined. He became a question keeper. People would come to the Enough House not for answers, but to sit with him and articulate the questions haunting them. How do I know when I've done enough? A young entrepreneur would ask. How do I forgive myself for my financial mistakes? A retired teacher would whisper. Evan rarely offered advice. Instead, he would reflect their questions back to them, refined and polished, or share one of his parables, allowing its meaning to land where it may. He had become a midwife for other people's insights, understanding that the most powerful truths are not taught, but uncovered within. The book of unknowing began to fill with a new kind of entry. He started drawing mandalas, intricate, circular patterns that emerged from a single point. He didn't plan them. He would simply put pen to paper and let his hand move, a meditation in ink. Each mandala was a snapshot of his inner state, sometimes chaotic and searching, sometimes perfectly symmetrical and serene. He came to see his entire life as one vast, complex mandala, with the initial $100 decision at its center, and every experience, every relationship, every struggle and triumph, radiating outwards in an expanding pattern of meaning. The edges of the mandala were open, forever unfurling into the horizon of becoming. His connection to the city of Baltimore deepened into a form of symbiotic love. He knew its rhythms intimately. The best time to find silence in the art museum, the particular curve of the river where the herons nested, the hidden alleys where jasmine bloomed in the spring. He no longer saw himself as a resident of the city, but as one of its organs, a part of its living body. He volunteered with city planners, not as a financial expert, but as an atmosphere consultant, advocating for green spaces, walkable neighborhoods, and public places designed for connection rather than consumption. He was tending to the soul of the city, applying the principles of his personal ecology to the urban landscape. A new, unexpected relationship blossomed. Her name was Clara, a botanist who had come to the Enough House to advise on the native species garden. She was a woman of quiet depth, with a scientist's mind and a poet's heart. Their connection was not one of dramatic passion, but of profound resonance. They could sit for hours in comfortable silence, reading or working on separate projects, their shared presence a gentle hum of contentment. They didn't complete each other. They complemented each other, two distinct melodies weaving a richer harmony. With Clara, Evan experienced the ecology of enough and love, a relationship free from the desperate need for validation, built instead on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and the spaciousness to let each other grow. This relationship became a new mirror. In Clara's calm, observant eyes, he saw a reflection of the man he had become, not the striver, not the guru, but a man of substance and peace. It solidified his understanding that the external achievements were secondary. The real work had always been the inner alchemy, and love was both the crucible and the proof of its success. The Tenders network continued its quiet, viral expansion. A cell opened in a different state, then another country. The principles were translated, adapted to different cultures, but the core remained. The rejection of the more paradigm and the pursuit of a life of purpose and sufficiency. Evan watched this global unfolding with a sense of awe. His small, personal rebellion against financial anxiety had become a tiny but significant thread in the global tapestry of a new, emerging consciousness. He was a single cell in a healing organism that was the human spirit itself. One winter morning, he sat with Ben in the sunlit reading nook of the Enough House. Ben, now growing frail, looked at Evan, his eyes twinkling. "You know," he said, his voice a soft rasp, "I used to think the goal was to arrive somewhere, to get the degree, get the job, retire comfortably. But you show me that the goal is to become someone, to become more and more yourself with every passing year. That's a journey with no end." Ben's words landed with the weight of a final, essential truth. The horizon of becoming was not a line in the distance. It was the ever-receding edge of his own expanding self. Evan realized that his entire financial journey had been a massive, decade-long red herring, a spectacularly effective one. The intense focus on money, the discipline of budgeting, the emotional roller coaster of the market, it had all been a rigorous training ground for his soul. It had taught him patience, resilience, and faith. It had forced him to confront his fears and define his values. And now, having mastered the curriculum, he could finally graduate from the School of Money and step into the boundless university of life. He closed the book of unknowing. He didn't need to write in it anymore. The questions and the answers had merged within him. He was living the book. He walked over to the window of the Enough house, where Clara was tending to a winter-blooming plant. He put his hand on her shoulder, and she leaned back into his touch. Outside, the bare branches of the trees were etched against the gray sky, holding the silent promise of spring. Evan Carter looked out at the horizon, not with ambition, but with a deep, welcoming love for all that was yet to come. The scared young man was a distant memory. The wise elder he was becoming was a gentle presence. But the man standing at the window, his hand on the woman he loved, in the house the community built, that man was fully, vibrantly, joyfully alive in the eternal, unfolding now. The horizon of becoming was not ahead of him. It was within him, and he was ready for its infinite, beautiful, and forever unfinished story.